I don't know how to be the kind of man you deserve, but I know that when I'm with you, I forget every reason I have to be afraid.
Rain hammered the neon-slicked streets of Gangnam as three black sedans screamed around a corner, tires shrieking against wet asphalt. Behind them, two police cruisers gave chase, sirens painting the night in stripes of red and blue. Gunfire cracked from the lead car's window, shattering a shop sign into a rain of glass. In the back seat of the last sedan, a young man in a black suit sat perfectly still. He did not flinch at the gunfire. He did not grip the door handle when the car fishtailed around a bus. He simply watched the city blur past the window, his jaw tight, his eyes cold as frozen stone. "Min-jae, they're gaining on us," the driver said, voice cracking with fear. "Then lose them," Kang Min-jae said quietly. "I don't pay you to state the obvious." The car swerved into an alley barely wide enough to fit it, scraping sparks off both walls. When it emerged 2 streets later, the sirens had faded into the distance, swallowed by the city's endless noise. Min-jae exhaled and straightened his cuffs as though nothing at all had happened. He stepped out of the car 3 blocks from his family's tower, alone, waving off his bodyguards with a single raised hand. "I want to walk," he said. It wasn't a request. No one argued with Kang Min-jae. Everyone in Seoul feared him, the police who couldn't touch him, the rival families who couldn't kill him, the businessmen who trembled when his name entered a conversation. He was 26 years old and already a legend whispered about in back rooms and courtrooms alike. Everyone in Seoul feared Kang Min-jae. Everyone except the one woman who had no idea who he really was. 3 miles away, in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat, Adaeze Okafor was scrubbing the last of the day's dishes and mentally rehearsing a legal argument for tomorrow's international law seminar. She was 22, brilliant, and utterly exhausted in the specific way that only working 2 jobs while chasing a law degree could make a person exhausted. "Human rights aren't a privilege," she muttered to herself, drying a mug. "They're a floor beneath which no state may fall." She smiled at her own phrasing. Professor Han would like that one. Adaeze had come to Seoul from Lagos 2 years earlier on a partial scholarship, determined to become an international human rights lawyer, the kind who walked into tribunals and made governments answer for what they'd done to the powerless. She waited tables at a small cafe near Hongdae 3 evenings a week to cover what the scholarship didn't, and she studied every spare hour in between. She was kind in a way that Seoul's cutthroat academic world hadn't managed to grind out of her, and fearless in a way that occasionally worried her professors. She had no idea, as she hung her apron by the door that night, that her life was about to collide with a world she couldn't have imagined in her worst nightmares or her most impossible dreams. The rain had not let up by the time Min-jae reached the narrow street behind a shuttered noodle shop. What he hadn't told his men was that the rival Choi family's assassin had gotten 1 shot off before the chase began, and the bullet had found his side. He'd been walking on Will alone for the last 10 minutes, and now, in the dark, his legs finally betrayed him. He collapsed against a stack of crates, blood spreading warm and wrong beneath his suit jacket, and for the first time in years, Kang Min-jae felt something close to fear. Adaeze found him 20 minutes later, cutting through the alley on her way home to save 4 minutes she desperately needed for sleep. "Oh my God!" She dropped to her knees beside him without a second's hesitation, her bag falling forgotten into a puddle. Hey, stay with me. Can you hear me?" Min-jae's eyes opened, glassy, struggling to focus on the face above him. Dark skin, rain-soaked braids, eyes wide with a fear that was entirely for him and not for herself. He almost laughed. In his world, no one looked at him like that, like he was simply a person who might die. "I'm fine," he rasped, which was a lie so absurd that Adaeze actually glared at him through her panic. "You are very much not fine. You're bleeding all over Seoul." She was already pulling her scarf free, pressing it hard against the wound in his side. "I should call an ambulance." "No," His hand shot up, closing weakly around her wrist. No hospitals, no police, please. Every instinct she'd built in 2 years of law school told her that was a red flag the size of a football field. But there was something in his eyes, not the calculation she'd have expected from a criminal, but something rawer, something that looked almost like a plea from a man who had never once had to plead for anything in his life. "Fine," she said, "but you're coming with me, and you're going to let me look at that properly, and you are going to tell me your name." "Min-jae," he said, because in that moment, stripped of his suit's armor and his family's name, that was all the truth he had left to give her. She half carried, half dragged him the 6 blocks to her apartment, ignoring the way strangers stared, ignoring the ache in her shoulders, focused only on the wet heat of blood soaking through her sleeve. By the time she got him onto her narrow bed and cut his shirt open with kitchen scissors, her hands were shaking, but her voice never wavered. "This is going to hurt," she warned, cleaning the wound with what antiseptic she had. "I've had worse," he said through gritted teeth, and she believed him, though she didn't understand yet how true that was. "What kind of businessman gets shot in an alley?" she asked, threading a needle with hands that had learned first aid from a summer volunteering at a Lagos clinic, never imagining she'd use it like this. "The kind with bad business partners," Min-jae said, and the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. She worked in silence for a while, and he watched her, the fierce concentration on her face, the gentleness in fingers that had just proven they could also be strong. No one had touched him like that in years. No one dared. In his world, hands reached for him only to shake his in false friendship or to point weapons at him in true enmity. Nothing in between. "There," she said finally, tying off the last stitch. "You'll live, barely. What's your name, your full name?" He hesitated a half-second too long. "Kang, Min-jae Kang. I run a security consulting firm." Another lie, though this one had at least a grain of truth buried in it. His family did, after all, employ a great many men whose job was security, in the loosest possible sense of the word. "Adaeze Okafor," she said, offering her hand as though they'd met at a party instead of over an open wound. "Law student, terrible taste in alleys to walk through." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Kang Min-jae laughed, a real laugh. Surprised out of him. He stayed 3 days while his ribs knit and the stitches held, sleeping on her couch, protesting that he needed to leave, never quite managing to go. His bodyguards found him by the 2nd day, of course they did. Nothing stayed hidden from Kang's security for long, but Min-jae waved them off from her window with a single sharp gesture, and they retreated to watch from a car across the street instead, bewildered and uneasy. Those 3 days became something neither of them expected. She cooked him jollof rice on a hot plate, laughing at the way his eyes watered from the pepper. "Your Korean stomach cannot handle real spice," she teased. "My Korean stomach has survived worse than rice," he said, reaching for water for the 4th time, and she laughed so hard she nearly knocked the pot off the burner. In return, he taught her how to fold dumplings properly. His hands that had done things she could never imagine, guiding hers with surprising gentleness. He told her about his grandmother's kimchi, the kind you could only get right if you understood patience, and she told him about her mother's egusi soup, and how nothing in Seoul quite tasted like home. "Do you miss it?" he asked one evening, the two of them sitting on her narrow windowsill, watching the rain finally clear into a bruised purple sky. "Nigeria." "Every day," she admitted. "But I'm here for a reason. I want to be someone who fights for people who can't fight for themselves, governments that disappear people, companies that poison villages and call it progress. I want to walk into a courtroom and make them answer for it." She glanced at him. "You probably think that's naive." "I think," Min-jae said slowly, "that it's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years." By the time his wound had healed enough to walk without wincing, they had fallen into something dangerously close to a routine, cherry blossoms just beginning to bud along the Han River. walks through hidden kafas tucked into alleys only locals knew, her arm looped easily through his as if they'd always belonged there. What Adaeze didn't know was that every one of those walks was watched. The council is asking questions, Mun-jae's second-in-command, Tusung, told him grimly one night in the tower's private elevator. A Nigerian law student, photographed with you 6 times this month. They're calling her a liability, a witness. They want her removed. Mun-jae's face went utterly still, the same stillness Adaeze had never seen, the stillness of the man who existed before the alley, before the jollof rice, before her laugh had started living somewhere behind his ribs. Removed, he repeated. Permanently, Tusung said carefully. The council has already voted. I'm only telling you because I owe your mother that much. Mun-jae said nothing for a long moment. Then, tell the council I heard them, and tell them if a single hair on her head is touched, I will burn every one of their houses to the ground myself. He didn't tell Adaeze any of it. Instead, the next evening, he showed up at the cafe where she worked, ordered the worst coffee of his life, and asked her to dinner as though the world weren't quietly deciding whether she should be allowed to keep breathing. Under strings of lantern light at a rooftop restaurant, 3 weeks after the alley, Mun-jae reached across the table and took her hand. Adaeze, he said, her name careful and deliberate in his mouth, like something precious he was afraid of dropping. I need to tell you something. Her heart lurched. You're married, she guessed, only half joking. No, he almost smiled. It's more complicated than that. Try me, I'm a law student. I love complicated. He looked at her for a long moment, at the rain-soaked stranger who'd saved his life without knowing his name, who'd fed him spice he couldn't handle and folded dumplings badly, and told him more truth in 3 days than his own family had in a decade. He wanted desperately to tell her everything, and he couldn't. Not yet. Not while the council's order still hung over her like a blade. I've never felt this way about anyone, he said instead, which was also entirely true. I don't know how to be the kind of man you deserve, but I know that when I'm with you, I forget every reason I have to be afraid. You're afraid of things, she asked softly. I thought businessmen who get shot in alleys didn't get afraid. I'm afraid of exactly one thing, he said, losing you before I've even had the chance to keep you. She should have run. Later, she would think back and know that some instinct, sharpened by 2 years of studying the darkest corners of human behavior, had whispered a warning even then. Instead, she leaned across the table and kissed him, rain soft and certain, and the warning drowned beneath the sound of her own heartbeat. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered against his mouth. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Neither of them knew how soon that promise would be tested. 2 nights later, Adaeze stayed late at the cafe to help close, and decided to walk the shortcut past the loading dock behind Mun-jae's tower, a route she'd started taking without quite admitting to herself why, hopping to catch a glimpse of him coming home. What she saw instead stopped her cold. 6 armed men in black, actually bowing at the waist as Mun-jae stepped out of a car, murmuring words she couldn't hear but understood with sickening clarity anyway. Tusung stood at his shoulder, speaking low and urgent, gesturing toward a black sedan with bullet holes stitched across its rear door. Adaeze pressed herself into the shadow of a delivery truck, heart hammering, and watched the man she loved transform into someone she had never met. She didn't confront him that night. She went home, sat on the edge of her bed, and did what any brilliant law student would do. She researched. Kang Group, holding companies wound through 5 countries, whispers on forums about the Kang family's real business, the one beneath the security consulting and the real estate and the shell of legitimate wealth, names of judges who'd taken money, names of witnesses who'd disappeared. By dawn, she knew, Kang Min-jae was the heir of Korea's most dangerous crime family. She was devastated in a way that felt like the floor of her entire life dropping out beneath her. Everything, the alley, the stitches, the dumplings, the kiss under lantern light, recolored itself in her memory into something monstrous. Had any of it been real? Had she been a fool, a mark, a witness he'd charmed into silence instead of eliminating? When he came to her door that evening, smiling, holding a small bag of the spicy snacks she'd introduced him to, she opened it with red-rimmed eyes and a voice like broken glass. "I know what you are," she said. His smile died instantly. "Adaeze. Don't." She stepped back before he could reach for her. "Don't you dare say my name like that, like nothing's different. I saw them, Min-jae, bowing to you. I know about your family. I know what you are." "Let me explain." "Explain what? That you let me fall in love with a lie. That the whole time I was, what? A liability the council wanted dead and you just didn't tell me." Her voice cracked on the last word, and hearing his silence, the guilty, damning silence, was its own confession. "I was protecting you," he said, low and desperate. "I told them if they touched you, I'd burn their houses down. I meant it." "I don't need protecting from a threat you put me in," she said, tears finally spilling. "I needed the truth. I built my whole life around telling the truth to power, Min-jae, and you looked me in the eyes for weeks and you lied." She closed the door. He stood there a long time before he finally walked away, and for the first time since childhood, Kang Min-jae, who had watched men die without blinking, felt his hands shake. She thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong. 3 days later, walking home from a late study session, Adaeze felt a hand clamp over her mouth before she'd even registered the footsteps behind her. She fought, clawed, kicked, screamed muffled against a gloved palm, but there were 3 of them, and the last thing she saw before a bag came down over her head was the insignia stitched onto a leather jacket, a red dragon curling around a knife. The Chuff family. She woke bound to a chair in a warehouse that smelled of rust and diesel, her wrists raw, her mind racing through every worst-case scenario her law textbooks had never prepared her for. A man crouched in front of her, mid-50s, scud, smiling the way sharks are said to smile. "Kang Min-jae's Nigerian girl," he said, almost delighted. "Do you know what you are, sweetheart? You're the only thing that man has ever loved, which makes you the most valuable hostage in Seoul." Word reached Min-jae within the hour, delivered by a trembling Taesung who had never seen his boss's face go so utterly white. "Where?" Min-jae said just that. "An abandoned dock warehouse in Uncheon. Boss, the council will use this. If you go in guns blazing for a woman who left you." "Get every man we have," Min-jae said, already shrugging into a tactical vest, hands steady now, the fear transmuted into something colder and far more useful. Now. The warehouse assault that followed would become, in the hushed ruttalungs of Seoul's underworld for years afterward, the night Kang Min-jae went to war for a woman who wasn't even speaking to him. Gunfire lit the dark in strobing flashes. Men fell on both sides. Min-jae took a graze across his shoulder and didn't so much as slow down, cutting through Cha's soldiers with a fury that made even his own men step back. He found her in a back room, bound, terrified but alive, and the sound she made when she saw him, a sob of relief she hated herself for feeling, told them both everything their fear hadn't let them say. "I've got you," he said, cutting the ropes with hands that trembled now that the danger had a face he recognized as hers. "I've got you. I've got you. I'm not letting anyone touch you, I swear it." "You came," she whispered. "I will always come," he said. "Whatever you think of me, whatever I am, I will always come for you." They made it out through smoke and sirens, and it was only when they were safe, when Adaeze finally let herself collapse against him and cry, that either of them noticed the black car idling at the warehouse gate, Min-jae's father, watching from the window, his face unreadable. The summons came the next morning. Min-jae stood in his father's study, a room of dark wood and darker history, and listened to the elder Kang lay out the terms of his life with the flat certainty of a man who had never once been told no. "You will end this," his father said. "The girl or the empire. Choose, Min-jae. You cannot have both. A leader with a foreign lawyer for a wife is a liability the council will not tolerate twice. She's not a liability, Min-jae said. She's the only honest thing in my entire life. Then you have already chosen, his father said coldly, and you know what that choice costs. Min-jae stood in that study for a long time after his father left, looking at the portraits of Kang men going back 4 generations, each one a little more powerful, a little more feared, a little more alone. He thought of Adaeze's hand stitching his wound with a stranger's trust. He thought of her voice cracking as she said, "I built my whole life around telling the truth to power." He thought of the warehouse, and how the only thing that had mattered in that burning dark was whether she was breathing. He found her at the cafe 2 days later, waiting tables in a life she'd built entirely without his money or his name, and he set a single folded document on the counter in front of her. "What is this?" she asked warily. "My resignation," he said. "From everything. I've signed control of the Kang organization over to my uncle. I've liquidated my personal holdings and donated most of it to the legal aid clinics you told me about, the ones that help people like you're going to help someday. I'm done, Adaeze, all of it. The empire, the fear, the men who bow because they're afraid not to. I choose you. I should have chosen you from the beginning, out loud, instead of trying to protect you with silence. Your father disowned me an hour ago," he said, and there was grief in it, real grief, but no regret. "I have no family name left to hide behind. No wealth, no mansion, no power, just me. It's not much of an offer." Tears blurred her vision. "You gave up everything." "I traded an empire," he said quietly, "for the chance to be a man who deserves you. That's not a sacrifice, Adaeze. That's the first honest decision I've made in my entire life." She came around the counter and kissed him, right there in front of the lunchtime crowd, and neither of them cared who saw. 5 years later, a small law office in Seoul's Mappa district bore a modest brass plaque, Okafor and Associates, International Human Rights. Adaeze had made partner the year before, arguing a landmark case before an international tribunal that made governments 2 continents away answer, finally, for villages they'd poisoned and voices they'd tried to silence. She still remembered sometimes, standing in that courtroom and thinking of the version of herself, who used to whisper legal arguments to an empty kitchen while scrubbing dishes. 3 blocks away, Min-jae ran a security firm that was, for once, entirely legitimate, the kind that protected people instead of threatening them, staffed largely by men who'd once bowed to him for very different reasons and now worked for a salary and a conscience instead. That evening, beneath the cherry blossoms along the Han River where they'd once walked as strangers falling slowly and impossibly in love, Min-jae pushed their daughter's stroller while Adaeze walked beside him, her hand in his exactly as it had been that first rooftop night. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked, watching petals drift down around them like slow pink snow. He considered the question the way he considered everything now, carefully, honestly, without the armor he used to wear. "I miss nothing about the fear," he said. "The men who bowed because they were terrified of me. The father who valued an empire more than his own son. I don't miss any of that." But he smiled, the same smile that had first surprised itself out of him in a stranger's apartment 5 years ago. "I traded an empire for peace," he said, "and I gained something far more valuable." He kissed her then, softly, the way he had 1,000 times since, and their daughter laughed at nothing in particular, the way small children do, and the 3 of them walked on together beneath the blossoms, no bodyguards trailing them, no council watching from the shadows, nothing left to fear at all. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting your enemies. Sometimes it's walking away from the life that keeps you from the person you love.